General Alexandre de Beauharnais, who took the place of Custines, had also been a member of that constituent assembly, so replete with honorable men. He had neither the faults of his predecessor nor his habit of command. The former was violent to an excess, and sometimes incapable of listening to the voice of reason. Still, he was beloved by the soldiers for his frankness and popularity. Monsieur de Beauharnais, on the contrary, had a cultivated mind and a calm temper. He was fond of order and discipline. His activity was boundless. His perception was quick and accurate. His valor cool and brilliant. The army soon became fond of him, modest and even a little circumspect. He showed reserve in the presence of the troops, and as he did not say much to them, he did not inspire them with the same enthusiasm as General Custine, who liked to make speeches, knew the names of every private soldier, visited the men in the camp and hospitals, and whose blunt good humor and repartees were quoted everywhere. General Delisle was also superseded and summoned to Paris, where he was thrown into prison. His successor as chief of the staff was Lieutenant Colonel Clark, of Irish extraction, who some years before had been attached to the Duke of Orleans. At the battle of the 17th of May, he commanded a troop of the 2nd Regiment of Cavalry, his horse having been killed in a charge. And being unable to procure another, he took up a musket and placed himself in the ranks of a company of grenadiers. That action was then considered as very courageous, and he was made a colonel. Monsieur de Beauharnais took him for chief of his staff and procured him in the rank of major general. Monsieur Clark added to a taste for his profession all the suppleness of a man who wished to advance, and that sort of spirit of intrigue for which his countrymen are reputed. He left the army on the 12th of October, having been superseded and sent to Paris. That campaign was the only one in which he ever served. He died a Marshal of France. I shall have more than one occasion to mention him, and although I have cause to be dissatisfied with him, I do hope to do him justice. Monsieur de Beauharnais hastened his march to Metz, and though the resistance of the enemy grew stronger from day to day, he succeeded in repelling him. After having fought for 5 days, we made ourselves master of Spire and Frankenthal. 2 days more, and we should have arrived under the walls of Metz, when accounts of the town having capitulated were received at our headquarters. We were forced to return behind the Lutter. Courage and good intention were the only qualities of the garrison of Metz at the beginning of the siege. The generals were intelligent and bold, but the attacks of the besiegers were so vigorous and repeated that the besieged soldiers, as well as officers, acquired both experience and valor in so remarkable a degree that they might afterwards be looked upon as the most formidable body the Republic was able to oppose to its enemies. The Prussians, eager to make themselves master of that barrier of the Rhine, and not caring what use the French government might make of these troops, were stationed with stipulating that they should retire into the interior of the country and not serve against the Allies for the space of a year. This article of the capitulation saved the Republic and cost the enemy dear. The garrison of Metz, commanded by the intrepid General Kleber, flew to the western departments, defeated the Vendeans, and when the year was expired, reappeared under the walls of Metz. Having returned to Weissenberg, we were soon obliged to prepare for the attacks of an enemy that had become formidable by his junction with the Prussian army and was, besides, free in all his movements. But the commissioners of the convention wanted first to abolish the distinction that still subsisted between the troops of the line and the battalions of national volunteers. The amalgamation was a difficult and dangerous operation at the moment of a decisive action. The generals explained their fears, but instead of being listened to, they became objects of suspicion. And just at that instant, a decree of the convention, having ordered the dismissal of all the officers who belonged to the nobility, the army of the Rhine was thrown all of a sudden into a state of confusion, of which the enemy did not fail to make use. The decree also concerned Monsieur de Beauharnais, By disobeying, he would have placed himself in open defiance to government. The commissioners, however, proposed that he should wait for an individual order and the appointment of its successor. But the Committee of Public Safety had already named the officer that was to command in his place. The choice had fallen on General Delmas, a young man of great merit, but as yet too inexperienced for so important a command in such difficult circumstances. He was, besides, at Landau, and that town being blockaded, his return to the army was impossible. General Beauharnais was deeply grieved at leaving the army. His noble spirit could not brook the thought of departing from the scene of the glorious contest, to which the voice of the country called all Frenchmen. In returning to the interior of the Republic, he moreover was exposed to innumerable dangers. He had constantly supported the system of representative government, and although he felt the necessity of defending a republic born amidst storms, yet the system of the Jacobins and their cruelty inspired him with horror. All the members of the Constituent Assembly were persecuted, and even the purest and most prudent conduct was far from ensuring him tranquility in an obscure retreat. I was in his closet at the moment that he was confiding his grief and regret to the bosom of his faithful friend La Horrie, who had been his secretary, who was then one of the officers of his staff. This gentleman advised him to attack the enemy and seek an honorable death, rather than expose himself to all the outrages of his foes in the interior of France. The advice was more courageous and wise. The general answered, I must first of all consider the interests of the army in my country. I do not flatter myself as to my future fate. But the death of so many brave men must not rest on my head, nor all the fatal consequences of a defeat. The army will perhaps be commanded by a more fortunate chief. Besides, the decree that supersedes me is positive. Even victory would be looked upon as a crime, and I see no possibility of gaining one at present. We have scarcely 35,000 men in bad order, and the enemy have 80,000. My death would be of no use. I must go. The day after, he resigned his command and left the army, which remained without a commander in the presence of a formidable enemy, and the organization went on but slowly. Little attention was paid to that state of disorder. 40,000 farmers arrived without arms or regimentals. They were undoubtedly well disposed, but they had no experience, having never faced the enemy. The choice of a general-in-chief was a difficult one. The post was first offered to General Laudremont, who commanded the vanguard, but he was a nobleman, and though he had great merit, he was recalled a few days after his appointment. Thus it was necessary to seek somebody else. And one Colonel Corbin did not fear to take the burden on his shoulders. 2 days after his appointment, the commissioners of the convention, to put him entirely at ease, dismissed abruptly from the army 13 generals, the chief of the staff, the commander of the vanguard, generals of division. No one was spared. This foolish measure was adopted on the 12th of October, 1793, and on the 13th at 4 o'clock in the morning. The enemy attacked us on the whole length of our line, broke through our ranks, put us to the rout, and at 8 o'clock we had lost the lines and were in full retreat towards Bront, and in the greatest disorder. By good luck, our 40,000 peasants were so active in their flight, they did not long embarrass our retreat. They had their houses and families to defend. The second day, there was not one of them who remained behind. Nevertheless, they afterwards became very excellent soldiers when they were recalled. But they had been rendered able to fight before they were placed in front of the enemy. The rear guard was well enough commanded to cover our retreat. It fought courageously on the heights of Bront during a whole day, so that the army had time to arrive at Haguenau. There the commissaries and the general-in-chief deliberated whether it would not be best to retire to Saverne and leave Strasbourg to defend itself. Happily, before they came to a resolution, they thought it necessary to consult Monsieur de Villemonzy, Commissary General of the Army. He declared that Strasbourg, having constantly furnished the army with provisions and stores, its magazines were completely exhausted, and at some time would necessarily elapse before the town could be put in a state to support a siege, so that If left to itself, it was to be feared it would be obliged to capitulate. Monsieur de Villemonzy was taken prisoner at Agunau, where he had remained to keep an eye on the evacuation of the magazines. The general opinion at the time was that he had delivered himself up. If that be true, I think he acted wisely. He would undoubtedly have been arrested on his arrival at Strasbourg and probably have died on the scaffold. He passed for an enemy of the Republic. I can say nothing as to that. All I know is that he was a well-bred, agreeable man, and that his situation was an object of envy. Villemonzy's observations made the council resolve to cover the town. The headquarters were established at Schiltigheim, a village a league from Strasbourg. The army extended in a line of more than 10 leagues from the banks of the Rhine to Saverne, and until orders from the government could be received, the chief commanded was entrusted to General Michau. This temporary choice was a wise one. General Michau was a prudent man who felt the danger of his situation and who did his utmost to make the best of it, presenting to the enemy an appearance of strength that forced them to be cautious. It was Wurmser who commanded the combined armies opposed to us. With a little more resolution, he might have beaten us once again, and perhaps made himself master of Strasbourg. But he reckoned on the friends he flattered himself that he possessed in Alsatia. He was persuaded that the bad government of the Jacobins and his own intrigues would make the whole population of the province fly to him. He was mistaken. The Austrians were still more detested than even the Jacobins, for the Alsatians were Frenchmen. While he was contriving low intrigues, the army had time to recover, and the eastern frontiers were saved. At last, the arrival of the general-in-chief was announced, but our astonishment was great when we heard the name of Pichegru. He was completely unknown to the army. After many inquiries, we learned that he had had an obscure command in the Department of the Upper Rhine, that he had served in the artillery of a non-commissioned officer, and that he had little while before been chief clerk in the War Office. The name of Pichegru, which a short time after became famous in France and all over Europe, was mentioned with contempt by all the giddy-headed youths of the army. A few days were, however, sufficient to gain him the esteem of everyone. I was still on the staff and was one of the first persons who saw him. He was about 35 and of middling size. His eyes were fine, full of fire and intelligence. His air was martial and his deportment calm and dignified in the highest degree. He began by restoring order in the army and by rectifying as much as possible all that was faulty in its positions. He again inspired the troops with a consciousness of their strength, spoke to them of their duty without harshness, and promised them success without exaggeration. The winter was then in all its rigor. Many were the obstacles to be surmounted, but they were the same for both armies. The Prussians and Austrians did not agree well together. Their generals hated one another, and Monsieur de Wurmser appeared timid and irresolute. Our part was therefore to make use of the favorable chances those circumstances presented us, to attack and raise the blockade of Landau. We soon received reinforcements, and Saint-Just, a member of the Committee of Public Safety, arrived unexpectedly at the army. The conduct of that young man made me acquainted with the existence of a government most terrible from its energy. While we imagined we were swayed by a turbulent and stupid assembly, Saint-Just severely reprimanded his colleagues and sent several of them away. He asked also an account of the causes that had led to the loss of the lines of Weissenberg. He arrested several generals and 8 or 10 superior officers. Among them were the poor noblemen who had not yet left the army. A sanguinary tribunal sentenced them, and they were shot in front of the ranks. This was a useless act of cruelty, for no treason had been committed, and the loss of the lines was much less owing to the generals and to the bad measures of the commissioners of the convention. But Saint-Just had read that the Romans sometimes made use of cruel severity to reestablish discipline among their troops. And that man, who imagined he possessed the genius of Sylla because he had his cruelty, thus made a prelude to the scenes of murder, which a few months after he extended all over France. He probably thought he had made a just compensation by threatening the president of the atrocious tribunal he had employed. This man was a wretched foreign priest called Schneider, who gloried in his assumed title of the Marat of the Rhine. For several months, he had acted as president of the tribunal and general of the Revolutionary Army and terrified Alsatia with his cruelty and debauchery. He used to travel through the province, followed by judges who were no better than robbers, and by soldiers who were his executioners. A guillotine drawn by horses, like a field piece, accompanied him everywhere, and when he arrived at any town, not one of the inhabitants could count on escaping. Sex, age, beauty, respectability, fortune, nothing was sacred in the eyes of this wretch. Of all the ferocious men that made themselves famous during that period, Schneider perhaps bore the greatest resemblance to Nero. The sight of death and blood gave him a sensation of unspeakable delight. The examples of this monster of cruelty have in them a sort of originality that makes one shudder, and one would wish to doubt their truth if the testimony of 100,000 inhabitants and the evidence of facts were not certain proofs of their existence. Saint-Just had the monster arrested and sent to Paris. There he was condemned, not for the crimes he had really committed, but for prior conspiracies that never existed. So far was justice reviled in those deplorable times. The campaign opened in the month of December. The right wing of the army was commanded by General Saint-Cyr and the left by General Desaix. General Hoche, who was at the head of the army of the Moselle, seconded our movements by vigorous and perpetually renewed attacks. Brilliant, though dearly bought successes brought us to the heights of Bront. They caused us both to love and respect our new general-in-chief. It was near Bront that we had a cavalry engagement with the corps of Condé, in which we were on the point of taking prisoners a part of that corps with the three princes who commanded it. The Duke of Bourbon was wounded, but he escaped by the devotion of the brave men that surrounded him, and by one of those chances, the influence of which so strongly modifies events. An officer of the 39th Regiment of Dragoons called Dieudonné had distinguished himself by valor on those same heights of Bront during our retreat. The commissioners of the convention sent him to Paris to present 2 standards he had taken. He was received with marked distinction by the assembly, and he returned to the army a month afterwards with the rank of general of brigade. In the battle which might have been so fatal to the Bourbon princes, Dieudonné commanded 2 regiments. That was too much for his experience. He did not know how to develop them in due time, and the princes were saved. His error was considered a crime. He was arrested and sent to Paris as a traitor. He died on the scaffold.